The Pokédex, the encyclopedia that records and arranges information about Pokémon after you have seen or caught one. In the main series games, the Dex has taken many different forms over the years, from the digital calculator of the early games to the Rotom phones we've gotten in recent years. But the fundamentals of the Dex have not changed a heck of a lot in that time. It's still the basic tool you use to access information about Pokémon you've encountered, and completing it is still essentially a large and daunting side quest given to the player when they start a game. For those of you who have completed a Dex, you know that it can take a really long time, not including the speedrunners. It can be quite laborious, and require a large amount of trading to get what you want. It's gotten somewhat easier in recent years with the implementation of internet connectivity, meaning trading with people who are very far away is possible, but with the spotty implementation of the global trade station and its various forms, it still presents the player with a huge challenge. But that's not actually what I want to talk about in this video. I was recently playing Pokemon Violet, and someone watching me play asked why the Dex was arranged in the way it was, seemingly puzzled. I somewhat dismissively noted that that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it'll probably remain. But it did get me thinking. The Pokédex is meant to be a high-tech encyclopedia. Ideally, it would provide easy access to information, help the player track their progress with metrics, and be somewhat interesting to flip through. I don't really think any iteration of the Pokédex has lived up to these ideals, so let's take a look at the history of the Pokédex as well as how it could be better. First, a point of clarification. I'll be talking about Pokédexes in the main series games, meaning I won't address the anime or side games. Also, as I can't read Japanese, I'll mostly stick to speaking about the Dex as it appears in English versions of the game, which is probably more important for the early games than the later entries into the series. Shockingly, the first iteration of the Pokédex appears in Gen 1, first with red and green in Japan and blue, red and yellow in the English versions. Gen 1 was created for the Game Boy, a piece of hardware with extremely limited capabilities, which resulted in some questionable programming choices being made that I won't get into here. However, it does affect the kind of data that was available in the Pokédex. We get a basic amount of information on each Pokémon: its name, height, weight, location that it could be found in, species, Charmander is a lizard species for example, and an audio recording of its cry. The Gen 1 Pokédex is important, because most, if not all, of these basic data are included in future iterations of the Pokédex. The Gen 1 Dex set the basic standard for what information a Pokédex should include. I have one somewhat severe criticism of the Gen 1 Dex, and that's that it missed a piece of information that would be more important than a Pokemon's height and weight to most people. That is, the Gen 1 Dex doesn't include information about what type a Pokemon is. So I can find out that Charmander is a lizard Pokemon that's about 2 feet tall, but I am unable to definitely confirm that it is a fire type. Or, if it evolved into Charmeleon and then Charizard, I would be unable to know that Charizard is now also a flying type Pokemon, solely using the Pokédex. It seems like it would have been an obvious thing to include, especially considering how consequential it is for battling, but whatever I guess. We now come to Gen 2. Not much of an improvement to be honest, which can't really be surprising considering how related the games are. Sure, Gen 2 has a lot more content and 2 regions and all that, but ultimately the hardware limitations are still pretty severe for Gen 2, and they ultimately chose to do other interesting things such as the backward compatibility trading, the battle tower, the day-night cycle, and breeding rather than making the Pokédex better. Also, Professor Elm can receive emails now. The Gen 2 Pokédexes are now in colour, as the Gen 2 games were made for the Game Boy Color, go figure. But it still looks like a pre-operating system computer. The Pokédex now offers the player the option to print out stickers displaying a range of information from the game, including Pokédex entries, boxes, mail, and other gimmicky bits such as Pikachu Beach high scores. You could also do this in Pokemon Yellow if you had the Game Boy printer, which was released in February 1998, 1 month before the release of Gen 2's Gold and Silver. The Gen 2 Pokédex also allows the player to arrange the entries by new and old mode. New mode is essentially the Johto regional Pokédex, but reorders the Kanto Pokemon to be next to their evolutionary kin. So, for example, in the old Pokédex mode, Scyther is number 123 in the Dex, and Skeezor is number 212. In new Pokédex mode, Scyther is number 110 and Skeezor is number 111. I can see the merits for players trying to figure out what things evolve into with the new Pokemon, but it doesn't include any information on the new evolution methods, such as happiness or trading while holding items, so it's somewhat of a lacking feature, I think. It also includes an A to Z order mode, which I think is probably the biggest improvement and makes finding specific Pokemon very easy. Also, we're still unable to find out from the Pokédex what type of Pokemon is, so there's that shortcoming carried over from Gen 1. Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald, Gen 3, a big leap forward both for the games in general and the Pokédex specifically. They introduced a bunch of new features for the Dex here. You can search for Pokemon that you've seen or caught, a useful feature for games that now include a national Dex of 386 Pokemon, including by a number of variables, including the first letter of their name, their colour, their type, I still have a gripe about this though, and you can order the search results in different ways. This is all great, and it does not stop there. You can now order the Pokédex in a number of different ways, from shortest to tallest, lightest to heaviest, the classic numerical order, and A to Z. Further, they added a new feature that is totally useless but I think very funny. The how large is this Pokemon compared to a roughly 10-year-old child feature, best demonstrated by Whale Lord in this game. Completely useless, yes, but something I enjoyed a lot as a kid for sure. Now, my main criticism of the Pokédex thus far has been that it has not included basic information about Pokemon, specifically their typing. Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald failed to reach this bar. Admittedly, you can use type as a search parameter to search for Pokemon, but instead of simply placing this information next to each Pokemon entry, they decided to do something different. To do not that. Fortunately, Fire Red and Leaf Green passed this metric with flying colours. The Pokédex in these games clearly displays the type of Pokemon in the encyclopedia view, noting correctly that Bulbasaur is a grass poison type Pokemon. Further, Fire Red and Leaf Green also allow you to filter Pokemon by type, but also include a habitat mode that will tell you where Pokemon you have encountered tend to appear. Not a particularly useful search metric, I admit, since you would always just use the route information to find where they specifically appear, but it is a very nice piece of world building, and serves to bolster the Pokédex's status as an effective encyclopedia. It's not there yet, but it is improving. Gen 4, more innovation. We retain all of the features of the Gen 3 Pokédexes, and they've now fully solved my complaint by including type information up front in all entries. Not only that, but the search engine is now expanded. You can use simultaneous filtering with body type as a metric. For example, you can specify that you're looking for a water-type Pokemon whose name starts with the letters P, Q, or R that is a bipedal Pokemon. That's great! They also included information about the time of day that Pokemon appear, as the comprehensive day-night cycle is back, and it won't destroy your save file this time. The award for the simultaneous most fun and most useless feature is that we can now remix Pokemon cries with some audio effects. You can slow down the audio, apply a chorus, a reverb, and a filter, and have the cries loop. Neat. Not at all useful, but it does make the whole encyclopedia, animal science, field biologist vibe feel a bit more complete, considering that is your explicit mission from Professor Rowan at the start of the game. Last, but certainly not least, the size weight to character comparison tool has been expanded to put the player next to the Pokemon when comparing weights. So when you inevitably place a Giratina on the scales, the player gets launched into the air. I say again, neat! The main criticism I have for the Pokédex in Gen 4 is the horrible decision in Diamond and Pearl to lock a bunch of new Pokemon, mostly evolutions of existing Pokemon, behind the National Dex, meaning the player cannot see them in the Dex during their normal playthrough, and can only obtain them via trade until they unlock the National Dex. I know that many people have made this very valid criticism over the years, but I could not make this video without addressing it. Also, I would personally prefer longer flavor text descriptions than the 2 lines we get for Pokemon in these games, just to bolster it a bit. I like a detailed world, rich with the deranged Pokédex entries which the series is known for, but maybe that's just me. Now we come to Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Professor Elm continues to receive emails. As for the Pokédex, it's largely the same as the Diamond Pearl and Platinum Pokédex, but with a couple of extra points which I think add a little bit of colour to the world building. We have the same searching and filtering options as before, no losses. But we also get some more options for individual Pokemon data. Specifically, you can now see what route Pokemon appear on, rather than just a highlighted segment of the map. You can also view male and female forms of each Pokemon, and any other forms that might take. For example, Deoxys' different forms. This feature is available in Diamond, Pearl and Platinum as well, but must be unlocked by progressing through the game. I do wish that when they had implemented the specific location information that they had been slightly more specific. For example, when it says that you can find Delibird in the Ice Path, it would have been cool if it specified or at least hinted at which floor or segment on the Ice Path Delibird appears in. I know that speedrunners use modified versions of the games that do this with an audio prompt, so certainly it would have been easy for the actual devs to do it, but overall it's still improving, which is good. Pokemon Black and White. I remember these games having been very divisive when they came out, for a number of reasons. They were vilified somewhat as a decline in Pokemon design, partially I think because this game introduced the most new Pokemon of any game in the series, including Gen 1. With that many more Pokemon, you're going to get some more misses. I personally quite like these games, particularly the revisions to them in Black and White too, but that's not actually the point of this video. Unfortunately, the Pokédex here takes some steps backwards, unlike the rest of the game, which was quite forward-thinking. I'll start with what I liked though. One incidental thing that I like here is that with the expanded Quick Select menu introduced in these games, you can now register the Pokédex like a key item and bring it up by hitting Y. Gives it more of a field biologist notebook vibe, which I think is great. Further, you can set it to different sections of the Pokédex, such as the search or information pages, which is a nice little customization. I do have a major gripe with the Pokédex in this game, which is that you have to progress a substantial amount through the game before you unlock the Pokédex's search feature. Now, it's not that I'm opposed to having to unlock a feature. However, this does not feel like a reward, especially considering it has been a standard feature of Pokédexes since Gen 3. Also, it's not even an expanded search feature with new search variables for you to use, and it's instead a more limited search feature than some in the previous Pokédexes. It's a bit silly in my view to take something away from players and then give it back to them later and claim that it's an upgrade, as the professor does here. On to Black and White 2. Thankfully, they realised that making you unlock a search function was dumb and totally did away with it. This might also be the game with the lowest amount of time for the player to receive a Pokédex. It is handed to you immediately after you receive your starter, and before you even do the first rival fight. The dex here is not substantially different from Black and White 1, my earlier criticism aside. The dex now tracks how many forms you've seen of each Pokemon, including shiny forms. The only other thing that separates this dex from Black and White is that you unlock Habitat mode after beating Sharon, the first gym leader. The Habitat mode is interesting, and shows you the Pokemon that appear in each area after you've caught them. The idea here is that you get a stamp when you've caught all of the Pokemon in that area, and thus have completed your task in that area. I like this, and think that it helps to flesh out the Pokédex into a more complete research tool, as the games so often like to suggest it is. Gen 6, X and Y. I'll make myself clear, I do not like these games. I do not enjoy playing them, and I especially did not enjoy playing them for the sake of this video. But they do have an interesting Pokédex system. They split the Pokédex up into 3 areas of the region, so there's a separate Central Kalos Pokédex, a Coastal Kalos Pokédex, and a Mountain Kalos Pokédex. I like this as an idea, as it makes more sense to me than randomly ordering the Pokemon with the vague idea that they were discovered in that order. It's also easy to flip through the areas to see which Pokemon are in which. I think it would have been nice for the completionists if there was a way to view all the regional dexes at once, like the national dex, but that's maybe a bit nitpicky at this point. Also, the search function works well, and they included a search parameter where you can search for Pokemon that you have seen but not caught, which is, again, great for completionists. Bad games, good dexes. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, much better games. Good Pokédex too. Admittedly, it doesn't do anything particularly creative or innovative, but it does have some nice bells and whistles, and it gets the basics right. You can see Pokemon's names in other languages if they have such names. You can also listen to cries and cycle through different animations for Pokemon you've caught. The search feature lets you filter results by whether you've seen a shiny or mega evolved form, and whether you've caught the Pokemon or not. Like I say, nothing really innovative here, no risks taken, but some nice bells and whistles. One slightly pointless feature here is that you can hit a button in the Dex and it will scroll through all of the Pokemon you've seen on the top screen. This has no effect as far as I can tell, but I guess it's cool. This Pokédex also has the dubious honour of being the only true National Dex I've ever completed fully and gotten the diploma for, which is more of an indictment of me than the Pokédex. Gen 7, Sun and Moon, the Alola region. I have few thoughts about these games, to be honest. I played them when they came out, enjoyed them, but had very little inclination to ever go back to them. The Pokédex is interesting though, and I think it's the best example of the devs tailoring the Dex to the region. There's a category of Dex for each of the 4 islands, visible from the very start of the game. Some Pokemon appear in multiple of the island Dexes, which is fine considering Pokemon have always appeared in multiple different areas. Also, you can share information with others using QR codes, which you can scan using the 3DS's cameras and get that information in your Pokédex. It doesn't give you the full Dex entry as though you had caught it, but it's an interesting idea. Moving swiftly on to Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, believe it or not, it is actually exactly the same Pokédex as in Sun and Moon. Zero substantive changes, so nothing for me to say there except for, you didn't even try anything? Generation 8, Pokemon Sword and Shield, the first entries in the series on the Nintendo Switch, a much more powerful piece of hardware than Pokemon games are typically released on. That new potential isn't really directed to the Pokédex, unfortunately, or these games. There is a couple of neat ideas here, but my main gripe is that they got rid of the search feature. I'm not sure you can claim that the Pokédex is a high-tech encyclopedia when it literally does not have a search feature, much like a written encyclopedia needs an index. Instead, the sort feature, A to Z, lightest to heaviest, etc., seems to be the suggested replacement. I do like that when you boot it up, it suggests Pokemon that you have info for and could go and catch. I also like the ease of which you can view different forms of Pokemon, considering that alternate forms of Pokemon are now commonplace. But they shouldn't have gotten rid of the search feature. That's bad and they should put it back in. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I'm not really going to discuss these much because they are, like much of the games themselves, a near direct port of the original games. They add a few features like a built-in evaluation of progress, and a couple of updates here and there, but ultimately they are the same as their direct predecessors. They're also broken train wrecks of games and are massively disappointing. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Such a choppy, glitchy mess of a game that somehow also manages to be the most fun to play since Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. If only they had delayed the release of these games 6 months, they could have been incredible. Anyway, 2-sentence review over. The Pokédex here is decent. Unfortunately, the search feature has not returned, so I guess that's just permanently gone now. However, I do still like this Pokédex. The Pokédex reward system and the open world catching experience make it very fun to fill up the pages. You get a reward such as money items, special Pokeballs, or rare candies every 10 Pokemon you catch, which both helps with more catching and is a nice incentive to catch more. Also, a somewhat unnoticed feature here is the notes system. Through the notes, you can get information about Pokemon's evolutionary forms after catching them. For example, I caught a Abomasnow, and when I checked the notes section, I now had location data for Snova. I think this is great, but it's somewhat buried and requires you to scroll down to actually see it. In my instance, I fully completed my first playthrough without noticing it was there. I do also like that gender and Pokemon forms are easy to access here, with Pokemon without genders such as Magnemite having that clearly noted on their pages. So it's decent, but bring back search. I now come to my conclusions. In most games, the Pokédex almost seems like an afterthought, where ticking the box of "there is one" is job done for the developers. Little thought seems to go into how it could be expanded or enhanced, or used as a tool for improving world building and immersion. Some Pokédex entries are absolutely deranged for the fact that they offer so little context, and the Pokédex itself is the perfect tool to expand on that utter insanity. There's so much more potential to the dynamic, high-tech encyclopedia format that the game tries to sell you on but does not deliver. I have some thoughts on different information that could be included that would make the Pokédex feel like a more interesting part of mainline Pokemon games, rather than an afterthought. Firstly, hints or information about how to evolve Pokemon. This could be held back as an unlock feature until the player progresses through the game, but I think it's a missing piece of the puzzle at the moment. Especially as the developers add more extremely esoteric evolution methods, having a hints or information system in the Pokédex to guide the player to try different things organically would be great. I also think it would patch the issue of constantly having to look up evolution information on the internet and make the game feel more complete as it goes. Secondly, more infometrics. The Pokédex is an encyclopedia, we're told, but manages to arrange the information in most games in the least visually interesting ways. Show me the evolution trees. Show me circuit board lines that expand and join as I catch and evolve things. Show me galaxies that fill with stars as I see shinies and mega evolutions and terraforms. Show me anything other than a list of names on a basic blue backdrop. I think there's so much more potential for what could be done here, but isn't. Though I will say the bookshelf approach of Scarlet and Violet was a step in the right direction. Lastly, I think there could be far better incentives for completing the Pokédex and making a genuine attempt at catching a lot of Pokemon. Oftentimes, it's incredibly easy to coast through the games without thinking about the Pokédex at all, and that's okay. Speedrunners again have this down pat, and that's a legitimate way to play the game. But for casual players who want to spend a little more time with the game, there is little incentive to complete the dex or even to get halfway. I'm not proposing a Let's Go Pikachu Eevee type scenario where it's a requirement to progress through the game, but where the player can get actual good rewards from adding information to the dex. The professor who starts you off has set the goal for you. There should be some reward for following through. This could be TMs, money items, battle items, competitive breeding or evolution training tools, whatever. Whatever it is, it could be so much more than what Scarlet Violet did okay with its Pokédex reward system. And those are my basic thoughts. I hope you enjoyed watching this video if you're still here, and let me know your thoughts on what's good about the Pokédexes in all games, and how they could be improved. Until next time.